So we're here to talk about what's new in React, and I only have 25 minutes to cover the entire React ecosystem. It can be done. Let's do it. So I'm Shawn. I also go by Swix on the internet. Like Mike just said, I recently joined AWS Amplify as a senior developer advocate. I used to be an active moderator on r/React.js. I've stepped back from that role a little bit. And more recently, I've been working on a book with coding career advice that I'm launching on July 1st. But that's more non-technical in nature, and we're here to talk about more technical things. So it's hard to take in all the news flow on React if you don't have a sort of mental model. And I've been working on mine since basically 2018, 2019-ish. In January 2019, I presented this model as star apps on my CSS Tricks blog post. And star basically is this acronym describing sort of like the areas of development and investment that I saw people doing. So like design systems, TypeScript, Apollo GraphQL, and static or server-side rendering. Since then, I found that this doesn't really describe enough. So I've actually expanded this to a sort of 6-point model. And we're going to go through this in this workflow, and you can see how everything just kind of slots in somewhere in this picture. So let's talk about core React. So in the past year, we've basically gone from React 16.9. So 16.8 was the one with hooks. 16.9 and on were basically minor iterations, basically. So like we had new testing APIs. We've got documentation for testing recipes. So that's actually new and the sort of official endorsement of React testing library. We have a new React.profiler component that you can use for more advanced profiler use cases. Most people won't need it. We got developer experience warnings. So for example, if you have shorthand rules versus more specific rules, React actually warns you. So that's also super interesting. And we've got deprecations. All these are just warnings of like stuff that you shouldn't use anyway. But we're going to take it out for React 17. And then finally, we've got more sort of official release channels. So we've got React at latest, React at next, and React at experimental. And this is better for sort of library authors to give feedback to the React team. If you're building against the experimental build, then you should be able to detect breaking changes with future functionality. Brian Vaughn has been doing an amazing job with React Dev Tools. He's got all sorts of new goodies, including a really good tutorial. Like I've never seen a dev tool have a tutorial before, but he just went well overboard. Some of the features I want to highlight are no more horizontal navigation, no side scrolling, and we'll see this in a bit. Component filters, as well as info summary tooltips. So let's have a look at some of these. Right, look at this scrolling all the way down, and you don't have to scroll sideways. Like it just fits. I don't know how he does it. There's just some math in here that's just fairly amazing. Filtering means that you don't really care that much about like the insane nesting that goes on, for example, with some of the CSS and JS libraries. And then this like an info tooltip just makes it easier to figure out like what's going on. You don't have to jump back and forth left and right. Of course, the other big ticket item is Concurrent React and React Suspense. This was launched experimentally last year and has not been production ready. I don't expect it to be out this year, basically because the React team has discovered that there are more things that they need to develop. But essentially, the mental model that you have to understand is that we're trying to change this default in React of like fetch on render, like we'll render and then we'll fetch, to something that's sort of, instead of sequential, it's more concurrent. Like we're fetching while we render while we fetch, and then we pause, and then when the fetch completes, we continue rendering where we picked up and left off. We're also going to have different rendering modes. So everyone is now in sort of the legacy mode. There's going to be a blocking mode for transitioning, and then there's a concurrent mode. Most people should be able to just toggle directly from legacy to concurrent, but it's very nice that they offer a blocking mode as well. And finally, what React is trying to do here is basically not taking the runtime as a given. Like they did an internal sort of performance study, right? And they realized that like React's footprint is only about 5% of real apps. So what if you could use that 5% to optimize the other remaining 95%? That's a very, very interesting research direction. And that's essentially what selective and progressive hydration is. And that will all be under Concurrent React, and they want to release all of it at once. And that's really interesting. And also remember that, of course, React is a Facebook technology, and that's inherently mixed in with FB5, which is the big rewrite that's been rolling out over the past year or so. So check out the official post from Facebook and Instagram engineering as well. So if you want to read out more about how it's being used in production. React Suspense is already being used at scale. We just, we're waiting for the official APIs. All right, so let's talk about routing. Routing, there's not that much going on in React. There's the big story is that React router v5 and Reach router had a big schism, and now we're merging it back. In React Router v6, the top changes, I mean, there are a bunch of breaking changes. Some people are not that happy about it, but it is the best judgment of the maintainers. Probably like the highlights that I would care about are like, you know, this like nested routes by default. That's very interesting for a component composition model, as well as a decreased size because they're dropping support for legacy browsers, and then they're also moving to React hooks, and that just is a lot less code, and that's super interesting. They're also taking TypeScript support super seriously and making it first class right now. So you can check out the full API reference on there, and you can probably already migrate if you want to, because this is pretty sure definitely the direction they want to go in. Alternative routers. So there are alternative routers. Most well known is Next Router, but there's also Navi and Curie. They're just not as prominent, and they're probably like tied up with other frameworks as well. So I wouldn't encourage you to check those out. I just want to mention them because React Router is not the only router in the game. All right, DevTools. DevTools also a very big part. These are like third-party DevTools, not responsible by the React core team. So of course, the vast majority of Webpack of React apps are built using Webpack, and all of them are rolling out new versions. Basically, none of them are like huge breaking changes. Rollout v2, Parcel v2. Webpack probably has the most buzz with module federation, and that helps you support micro frontends, and as well as asset modules. So all those like default loaders that everyone uses are actually kind of built in now by default, and that's very interesting because that's something that I've talked to Shawn Larkin about, but I didn't do anything about it. They did it, so all credit goes to them. The innovation actually comes in the next generation of build tools outside of those core sort of JavaScript bundlers. So for example, we can build tools not in JavaScript for JavaScript. So we can build it in Go, and we can see that ES build is about 100 times faster than Webpack, or SWC built in Rust is about 70 times faster than Babel. So those are very interesting areas of optimization. We can collapse all these tools that are doing individual jobs separately into a single tool, that we can do a single pass of AST and have a lot better defaults. So that's what Rome and Deno are doing. And then we can also explore using ES modules in development, because that makes for very fast hot reloading. So that's Snowpack and Vite. I like to say Vite, but it's Vite. Sandpack, the Code Sandbox bundler, is also doing some interesting things. So check out Yves' React Europe talk this year. I think it was about 1 or 2 months ago, where you can actually directly modify code in the UI, and it reflects in the code itself, and that's super interesting. Obviously, there's source maps underneath, but it's amazing that he just did it for fun. Like it's just part of Code Sandbox now. DevTools. Basically, everyone has consolidated on MDX, and that is the best way to write documentation and sort of tooling in React. And MDX itself has a V2 coming, but there's also, you know, all these other interesting documentation tools that you can use, and it's great that we seem to care about documentation that much, right? TypeScript has basically won. So here's a list of everyone that have moved over to TypeScript in the past year or so. I mean, some of them are moved. Apollo has been TypeScript from the beginning. Ionic has been TypeScript from like I think the beginning or very early on, like like they were just saying. And of course, React itself is not TypeScript. If you want to learn more about React and TypeScript using them together, I maintain the React and TypeScript cheat sheets. And basically, there's sort of a good set of docs for people who already know React, already know JavaScript, and just want to know the intersection of React and TypeScript. Okay, state and data. This is the most complicated part of the talk because there's so many options. I can't even keep up. But the first two are sort of like the default ones built into React, and if you don't know about prop drilling, just go Google it. It's a very simple concept. And then there's Redux, which has been seeing a lot of it's been saved essentially by Redux Toolkit because there's a lot of people complaining about the complexity of it. And so Mark Erickson has been working really, really hard on making it simpler to adopt, and I can say he's been doing a good job. There's a Redux template built into Create React App now, so you can go Create React App -- template and then put in some sort of Redux template there, and that's maintained by the Redux team, and that's amazing. So instead of top-down updates, there's also sideways updating for really big apps, and that domain is sort of owned by MobX and Recoil. Recoil's the state management sort of atomic update library that was open source from Facebook. So automatically is super interesting. And there's a very good comparison thread from Michel Westrate, I think that's his name, comparing MobX and Recoil and saying like how similar they are. But definitely go check that out if you're interested in that. And there's of course there's also Apollo Link State, which is Apollo clients sort of approach to state management using GraphQL. This is the results from our React subreddit survey showing the sort of relative split. So basically, like almost 2/3 of the community just uses native React. 2/3, I don't know, I don't know what percentage this is. 40%, 40%, and then like the remainder 20%, right? So yeah, that's cool. And this is the Apollo sort of state model that that Apollo is trying to push. Data fetching, there's so many libraries, and I kind of split it into like sort of data model agnostic and then GraphQL focused, and that's kind of like how I see the world. So there's obviously native fetch, and then there's Axios, but then there's also React Async, which I really like over Axios actually. And then there's integrations with Redux, SWR, and React Query. So these are not, they don't force you to use GraphQL. You can use GraphQL with them if you want, but these are just very nice layers that interact with REST APIs. And then here are all the sort of GraphQL focused clients, and all of them are seeing active development as well. I highlighted some of these things in orange because I wanted to show you how many of these use caches, client-side caches. And that's something that's, I think, new and emerging, that we're realizing that all React apps basically need a cache, and either you handwrite it, like the app developer handwrites it, or the library manages it for you, and you just sort of interact with it with a very strict contract. And I think that's going to keep going. So I'm going to talk about it now. And it's this realization that front ends are basically a distributed part of your backend system anyway, right? And either you're handwriting that code that sort of interacts with the backend, or the library sort of takes care of it for you. And the realization is that like there's a certain set of things that we all want. Like we want our apps to be offline first, because that is they work offline, but then it also makes them update really quickly, right? So there's nothing that feels faster than offline first app. You want automatic syncing, so if someone else edits the same field, you want to be notified as well. You want key-based cache invalidation, stale-wall revalidate, all this stuff that's pretty normal. You may even want, for example, authentication checks. So like if the user tries to edit something that they shouldn't be allowed to edit offline, you might want to not disallow that, right? Like so. Basically, you need to ship some part of your backend schema to your front end, and that's kind of what I felt when I look at the, for example, the Apollo docs. We're trying to like shoehorn this like optimistic response model inside of our existing apps, and really we should just have a cache that takes care of it. So that's personally why I'm interested in Amplified Data Store. I'm just speaking for myself, not as an AWS employee, but essentially like let's just have a cache with a very strict contract for backend. And then we just interact in our front end. We just interact with our cache, and that takes care of all of this stuff. I don't want to handwrite any of this. This is so commodity, so cookie cutter that I mean, like for every app should have this. Just every app. And if Amazon doesn't do it, like someone else should write it by themselves. So I blogged more about this in this blog post, optimistic offline first apps, and you can go look up on my site if you want to check that out more. Okay, components and hooks. So these are sort of community components and provided hooks. Yeah, there's a lot of them. And what's amazing is that most of these have full-time employees on them. Like Material UI, they've gone in full-time. Ionic. Well, I particularly want to highlight Chakra because they have this like really focus on good design and accessibility. Not that like a lot of these all have them. It's just that like they've been getting quite a lot of steam recently, and I just wanted to shout that out for people who are not so close to the React ecosystem to check it out. And Seguna Adebayo is just pretty amazing on Twitter as well. But all these are great. It's just that you should be aware that you're adopting a particular design system, and if you want to customize it, you have to work around the APIs that they give you. Sometimes that's good enough for you to get started and get going quickly, especially for like the bootstrappy type of systems. But sometimes you want to drop down one layer and just use the components that have been provided. So there's a set of developers that are working on those parts as well, and those are typically the more complex components. For example, the people working on charting on the right, and then the people working on forms on the left, as well as tables. I don't actually know any other table libraries. I'm very sure they are. I haven't needed it. So just because I'm friends with Tanner, I wanted to shout out to React table. The two main shout outs that I want to give here are React Hook Form and Formic. So these are very, very interesting sort of form libraries for React that make form management a lot easier. Again, like forms are probably like most of apps are CRUD apps, right? Like we have to do data entry, and we probably should have very good built-in defaults for validation and dirty field checking and all that. So these guys really do it right. So want to give a shout out to them, as well as the recently announced capacitor elements. I just snuck this in there in the keynote. Okay, so companies themselves are also building SDK components with React, and that's an attempt to reach out to you, the front end developer. With pre-built components that you already have and that talk well with their backend APIs. So Stripe just released their React APIs, and so like a lot of people try to build these as individual SDKs. But I think one of the interesting appeals of Stencil and what Ionic's working on is that you can build one code base and just provide these SDK components for a lot of different frameworks, and that's actually what we do at Amplify. And so I want to give a huge shout out and thanks to to Ionic and the Stencil team, because we use Stencil at Amazon, and it's great. There's no way we could support all these frameworks without it. So highly recommended. There's also community hooks. It's surprising that there are not that many that are the dominant hooks libraries, or maybe they're just sort of split up into individual use cases. So here, for people who are doing basically in browser editors, there's sort of the movable hooks, and then there's also basically common use platform interaction hooks that people have been working on. It's also used off by my friend Swizek Teller, which does what it says. It helps you connect with any authentication library as well. All right, and that's all the sort of userland stuff. And then now we approach styling. And there's a reason I left styling at the end. Normally, I actually initially put styling somewhere lower, because that seems like a more foundational tech choice when you build an app. But I left it towards the end for a good reason. I'll show you later. So styling, I think this normal styling is basically a settled case. You either use CSS modules or vanilla CSS or post CSS or Sass, and you just kind of import it that way, and you deal with separate files, or you use inline styles and you write it all in JavaScript, and it blows up your JSX by quite a bit. Most people want some sort of CSS and JS. So there's static CSS and JS, and then there's dynamic CSS and JS. So the two main players are Lunaria, AstroTurf, Style Components, and Emotion on the dynamic side. And I would say that most apps will be fine going with just static. So I want more people to start checking out these things, but then also be able to incorporate this into your use case, because dynamic CSS and JS is the most powerful form of this. It's just that it imposes the most JavaScript weight as well. I think what everyone should be super interested in. Anyway, that's some APIs. I think what everyone should be super interested in is this new movement towards atomic static styles. And this is again, there's two different versions of this. First, you can write the atomic units independently by using a utility CSS framework. Here I want to highlight Tailwind, because that's just got a lot more steam than Tachyons these days. And here you're just writing preset classes, and then you're using an established grammar to write all this stuff. Or you can use Facebook's StyleX component. So they talked about this at the last ReactConf, where you write normal CSS, and it'll just be compiled to individual utility styles during the build step. Facebook has not open source StyleX yet, but there's an open source clone attempt at CSS 0. And the whole idea is to change the curve, right? Bend the curve of CSS. As you write more components, you have more CSS. We want to bend that so that any sort of CSS that's repeated, that gets reused, right? So we're not scaling linearly; we're scaling sublinearly in terms of CSS. Again, in the FV5 rewrite, you can see the benefits of that. They cut their CSS load by a lot. Okay, so that's the sort of 6-point model. But now we talk about the combinations of them, right? So Create React App is a combination of React and Webpack, right? Or we can talk about Next versus Gatsby, which is all that plus routing, right? And then some sort of data layer. So Next.js versus Gatsby, now they're very clearly JAMstack Metaframeworks. Next.js was more sort of server side for a bit, but now they've in the past year they've really moved into the JAMstack space. Both of them support incremental builds now. It's extremely competitive. It's TypeScript support. Next.js is API routes, which I appreciate a lot, and I think everyone should have that in some way. But it does take more of a contract with the server side. And there's just a lot of development. I mean, they're just amazing teams on both sides. And I personally like the simplicity of Next.js. Gatsby has a lot of API and a lot of plugins, but a lot of plugins that also make your initial experience easier. And the emphasis on the incremental builds is a big deal, especially in the JAMstack framework, JAMstack world, because we rely on builds being fast, and they can really cut builds because they only rebuild the parts of the site that needs to be rebuilt. So I think that's a very positive improvement that I see in all of the JAMstack frameworks. Okay, so let's also start including in our meta frameworks state and data and components and hooks, right? So these are the sort of new Rails for JS React frameworks. These were both released this year. Blitz.js is more focused on server rendering because they use Next.js under the hood, and Redwood.js is more focused on client-side rendering and no server-side rendering at all. So there are different sort of pros and cons to both. Redwood has more sort of off form and messaging components, whereas Blitz goes more in the direction of hooks. But both are very new, so use the appropriate sort of caution when you check them out. But honestly, like sometimes they're built on top of so many things, and you can feel like a little bit like you're just like on this like multi-layer raft, and you're just like I don't know like what I'm using underneath, but I'm just trying to steer the ship anyway. And the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? Like it's like either you write this yourself or someone else writes it for you. The question is, do you need it? So and that's something that only you can answer. Over in the so everything I've been talking about is web only. Over in the cross-platform React world, there's a lot of developments as well. There's a lot of developments in React Native. I think the new sort of renewed React Native team that Christoph and other people have been putting together are just like crushing it, really. And outside of Facebook, there's a lot of work being done by Expo, Ionic, and then just like the rest of the big league tech companies like Microsoft and Shopify are also showing serious adoption. Like we're talking many millions of developer hours and time. So I don't know, cross-platform React is here to stay, and I think React is the best framework for cross-platform app development, like bar none, right? So it's just amazing to watch. Lean core is going really well. There's obviously still some progress to go. And I just want to give a special shout out for React and Expo and Ionic for helping in this current coronavirus pandemic, because people building apps to help each other and do contact tracing and all that. And you can see that in the downloads, and it's pretty amazing to watch. And I think making app development easier, helping to improve the lives of regular people, I think that's why we're all here. There's still progress in alternative React renderers, so you can render React to CLIs. Gatsby is using React Inc, for example, to do the new Gatsby recipes functionality. React 3 Fiber is always super amazing. I just had to include this just because it's just so crazy. Like his demos are like our 1-year projects. And if you want to learn how to write a React renderer, check out Sophie Alper's talk at the last Ioniconf, writing a custom React renderer, because you can use React to render anything, and that's pretty much the core of React. Like it's the universal UI language, and that's all of it. That's what we're here to talk about in terms of like the 6-point framework. And hopefully this helps you have a good mental model to think about what's new in React from now and also going forward. Let's talk a little bit about like why all this innovation is going on. And I think it's basically we had this like installment age of like here are all the frameworks that we're innovating, right? And that's been happening in the past 10 years. And now that we like know what frameworks are, let's build on top of them, because that framework is basically stable, right? That's why I started off with the assessment core React, that like not that much is coming out. Like apart from Concurrent React, which is taking a huge chunk of work, it's just like incremental fixes, and that's good because that's a stable base from which, on top of which, we're building all of this stuff. So if you sort of view React as an operating system for your apps, then we're consolidating and building distros of React on top of React itself. And that's essentially what and in sort of like broader historical JavaScript context, React is actually this year actually passed the same age as JavaScript jQuery was when React was released, right? So is that question of like is something else going to come out and kill React right now? But like jQuery never really went away. It just got absorbed into the platform, and that's a very interesting feature for React. If that ever comes about, I don't know. I don't know that it will. But I sort of wrote about this thesis as sort of JavaScript's third age, right? Like if you track jQuery from the inception of JavaScript, and then jQuery to React is about 7 years, and now we're just at the point of like 7 years after the open sourcing of React. What happens here? I don't know, but it's going to happen, along the problems that we already have, which is those 6 points that we already talked about. So that's it for my talk. 25 minutes on the dot. If you like more, if you want to see more of my React talks, you can go to swix.io/speaking and have a great conference. I think this is amazing, and I'm so excited to hear what all the other frameworks are doing and what Ionic people are doing as well. All right, thank you.